we're going to start with presenting argument and have a chat about your oral presentation. So Vika wants you to use persuasive language techniques to persuade your audience of your contention or your reason for writing that oral, and back this up with your sub arguments in order to justify your opinion. So essentially, you can think of this as almost reverse engineering analyzing argument. You're not analyzing an article that someone has written, but you're creating your own piece of persuasive language. So you're trying to persuade people to hold the same views of you, whatever you're trying to make the audience think or feel or believe, you're trying to make them think or feel or believe it as well. Therefore, really important not to have a bunch of overload of information in your oral, but to use a lot of persuasive language techniques that are convincing, and of course have a rebuttal somewhere in there as well. So important to know that this is your Unit 4 SAC. It's going to be worth 40% of your Unit 4 SAC marks. And 30% of this is coming from the actual presentation, both the written up oral that you have as well as your delivery, and another 10% coming from your statement of intention. This is very similar to what you did for the creative SAC. This is you justifying some of your choices, analyzing why you have chosen certain word choices and persuasive language techniques, and analyzing them in terms of intended effect and contribution to the argument, or both. So you'll have about 5 to 6 minutes time limit for this presentation. So it is not a very long task. Therefore, it is very easy to do well here and get good marks. And I really recommend putting a lot of effort into the SAC. You do have to choose a recent relevant issue. It has to have appeared in Australian media since September 2022. More specifically, you can just look at the year 2023. So if you see some interesting subjects of discussion that come up over maybe say social media or the news, that can give you ideas for a topic to choose for your oral. There are quite a lot of things happening at the moment. Maybe you find it interesting to discuss about maybe ChatGPT or increasing AI or political ongoing issues such as the voice to parliament or inflation and cost of living crisis in Australia. There are lots of ideas, hopefully. And of course, research is a crucial part of developing your oral presentation. So here are some links to some websites that can give you a lot of articles. Essentially, once you've chosen your topic, you're gonna have to read up on it, get some ideas for your own writing by seeing some articles and the persuasive devices that they use, and also accumulate some things that you want to put in your oral as well. So it's maybe some evidence, some statistics, or some expert evidence or quotes from these articles as well. What you can also do is type in your topic into the search bar on Google, do a search and go into the news section and see lots of articles come up in one place. However, try to stick to more reputable news media and avoid tabloid articles as well. So in terms of writing your speech, of course, you might be thinking, how do I structure my oral to make it engaging and to make it good? So for your introduction, you want to start with some kind of hook to engage your audience straight away. Don't just start with the background information around your issue, because that won't be impactful and it will be a bit boring for your audience. So keep that until after you've delivered some kind of hook to immediately engage your audience with something interesting. And this could be starting with a persuasive language technique. You might start with an anecdote. You might start with a staggering statistic, maybe, or a piece of evidence, or a quote, or some emotive language, or even a hypothetical account, if you're going for a more emotive approach. Another strategy that's really interesting is bookending. You can use that to conclude as well if you're both struggling with how to start and how to finish. Essentially, your first sentence is the start of an idea, and your last sentence of your piece is finishing that idea. So it might be, for instance, that you start with one half of an anecdote and then you finish that anecdote or that story at the very end, or you pose a rhetorical question as your hook and then you answer it at the end as a conclusion. And that can be a very impactful way as well. So, hope those strategies help. But once you've done a hook, then you can lead into that contextual information, introduce what you're going to be talking about, give some information around why it's a relevant issue and why it's a good or a bad issue. And of course, you need to make your contention really, really clear as well. What do you want your audience to do or feel? Basically, make it clear if you think the issue is good or bad and why, and what do you want to be done about it? What should the audience think? And all of your sub arguments, your body paragraphs, is your justification for that contention, all those mini arguments that you have. So aiming for 2 to 3 main points, usually starting off simple with introducing the issue. Your first argument just might be based around if it's bad or good, and then stronger arguments, last argument usually around a call to action or a proposed solution. And somewhere in there, you're aiming for a rebuttal, an idea that basically the opposing group, people that think the opposite to you, why they think that way and why it's wrong. So you refute it. We see a sentence structure that might help you to kind of understand how you could structure that. Don't spend too much time on the rebuttal. It's kind of pretty much, it can just be a mini point that you have in your oral, but you need to have one. And then in your conclusion, summarize what you've discussed and try to end on an impactful note. We talked about bookending and how that might achieve that. Finish on some impactful, emotive sentences, maybe calls to action, some impressive appeals. So, planning for a speech, we have to plan out everything, both for our statement of intention and as well as for what we're going to be talking about. We need to make sure that we have a contention and all of our arguments planned out. So, for example, we might be talking about the sugar tax within the Australian government's debate around it. So, our contention could be that the Australian government must implement a sugar tax, which we think is absolutely necessary. And that's plain and clear, just simply what we're trying to convince the audience of. So, what are some arguments to back that up? We might be saying that current health measures, such as health star rating, voluntary codes of conduct, and marketing, are inadequate on their own to limit obesity and excessive sugar use and diabetes, etc. Of course, we've dot pointed the ideas that we would actually discuss for that argument as examples that have been ineffective. Then we get more complicated in the second argument and we're delving a bit deeper. You can get some ideas for more complex arguments when you're researching as well. So, for example, taxation revenue could be used on recreational and health related infrastructure, such as hospitals, which can also create more jobs. So, talking about taxpayers' money here, kind of a part of the issue, but not as obvious. And that can make for a strong argument. And then we have a rebuttal argument that some argue that taxing sugar might have detrimental effects on the sugar industry. However, we're going to say that this will actually encourage companies to create healthier food products, might not actually big impact at all, and maybe even bring in that sugar sales will continue to be very, very high anyway, most likely. So that could be a plan that you'd like to follow. Now we'll have a look at some sample hooks. So we talked about having an impactful start. Let's see how these examples achieve this. So consider this: an Australian Muslim mother of two is deeply in love with the Victorian town her family feels lucky to call home. But after she clicks on a Facebook page titled Stop the Mosque in Bendigo and is met with a torrent of anti-Islamic rhetoric and even personal threats, she begins to question the community she thought had embraced her family. So we see some emotive, lots of emotive language here. You're using this hypothetical account before it introduces the actual context of the issue, before it gives the specific details of, oh, this is an actual individual and all the evidence around the mosque, and introducing the issue itself. Essentially, we're kind of with the hook, we're trying to say, so this is why the issue is important and engaging, and this is why you should listen to everything else that I have to say and all my arguments. This consider this is a pretty impactful construction as well. Let's have a look at another example. African Americans lined the streets of their communities with their hands up as they begged cops not to shoot. As the movement started in the wake of Trayvon Martin's death, still echoes in their hearts, still pleading for their right to safety and protection, reminding us that their lives matter, that Black lives matter. And we see that repetition in these sentence structures has been very impactful. Repetition of still, reminding that, repetition of that. And notice how it's used variations in sentence length as well to create an effect, starting with a long, impactful sentence filled with emotive language, addressing a touchy subject, the death of an individual, and therefore, again, another impactful hook. You can go again, as I mentioned, for something more simple, like starting with a statistic or a rhetorical question as well. But this would be a more detailed example. Also depends if you're trying to go for a more emotive approach with your oral or a more rational kind of approach to your argument. So, we said this is sort of like a reverse analyzing argument because we ourselves have to use and implement a range of persuasive language techniques. Is what you've been studying for a long time, so shouldn't prove too difficult. Show how you can use that language to persuade by also analyzing it in your statement of intention and try to make them easily identifiable. So make sure that it's clear when you are using a persuasive language technique. For instance, looking at this example, this is supported by the professor of the Institute for Religion, Politics and Society at ANU, Irfan Ahmad, who noted that with the rise of ISIS claimed violence, Muslims in our community and around the world are slowly losing their individualism. So we're making it very clear that it's expert evidence as our persuasive language technique that we've used here. We're crediting the individual and showing how they are an expert. So note that construction there, and that's how you can make it really clear. Of course, some things will be subtle and they have to be that way. Don't just use only the plain, easily identifiable persuasive language techniques. Use some more subtle ones as well, like appeals, and make it clear that you're targeting certain audience groups and trying to speak to them. So delivery matters. In fact, quite a substantial portion of your marks for your oral come from delivery. It needs to be impactful. So consider body language, your voice, and cue cards as well. All of this you need to plan out, practice, consider how you're going to do it. So in terms of body language, really important that we have open body language. So stand up straight, have a good posture. Don't look kind of curled into yourself and anxious. Look confident on the day. Look relaxed and confident. Gestures, so obviously don't stand stiff in place. Don't be afraid to move your hands around and gesture throughout your oral for some more impact. And holding eye contact all around the room. So looking around 2 to 3 seconds, maybe at different people, not just staring to one place or staring down at the ground. Really important to be engaging, and you need to do all of these things to be engaging. Use the space that you have. Don't be afraid to move your hands. If you're using props presentations, don't be afraid to use the space. And hold your cue cards away from your body rather than close to your body. Hold them away from your body so that you can maintain that open body language. With your voice, plan your vocal effects that you're planning to employ. So first of all, you don't want to speak straight away. Make sure that everyone is quiet before you start with your oral. Speak slowly and clearly, don't rush. If you're finding the need to rush in order to finish in time, it really means that you need to kind of cut down on some word count in your oral and cut some things out. You should not have to rush at all. And nerves can get you to speak quickly, but you don't want to finish your 5 minute oral in 3 minutes because you got very nervous. So practice can help to prevent that, especially practice in front of other people. Project your voice by looking up and forward, not looking down, not um, uh, yeah, just speak loudly and clearly. Vary your tone as well, and utilize your vocal effects. So either short or extended pauses, rising and falling, intonation. Consider where you want to go louder or more quiet. Where you want to intentionally speed up to create an effect of this is something really serious, or where you want to slow down to uh, make an emotional impact. With your cue cards, you can absolutely have cue cards. Some students do memorize their orals. It's not too hard because it's a few minutes, and with consistent practice of your oral, it is quite easy to achieve. I really recommend trying to memorize it and not relying on your cue cards. If you do use cue cards, you want to make sure you are not looking down at them all the time. It should be maybe only every once in a while where you really need it, where you need to see that sentence because you've kind of forgotten what to say. So don't handwrite on your cue cards. They need to be printed with a large font that it is so that it is very clear and easy to find everything there, and you're not just searching or struggling to read something out. It can be annotated with instructions, including your vocal effects, to make sure that you practice them every time. And you can use bold or highlights for something, such as the sentences that you find or phrases that you often forget and get stuck on, or where your arguments or topic sentences are very clearly stated. And there's some additional tips that you may consider for presenting argument. You can choose to pick a persona in a very specific target audience. So you might just choose, not to just be yourself as a student and your target audience is all these other students. You can make it interesting by adopting the language and really relaying a persona that you have picked. For example, if you chose as a topic Australian media law, you may have chosen to adopt the persona of a small news journalist targeting big news journalists who called for the law to be passed. So then, I'm presenting as a journalist, of course, I would expect to have quite elevated vocabulary and strong journalist type arguments, kind of like what you see in articles, lots of persuasive language techniques scattered around. But I might also be relating how the issue applies to journalists as well, and often referring back to my interest as that stakeholder. Similarly, with vaccine hesitancy, you might adopt the persona of an ICU nurse, targeting Australians older than 60 who have no choice but to take the AstraZeneca vaccine, probably to calm them down, assure them of how it is not harmful. And using a lot of medical evidence and terminology and reasoning to back that up. So you can see how this can be a really useful strategy. We'll see a bit of an example of this later on as well. So you also need to clearly signpost in your speech every once in a while. Don't use words like linking words too frequently, but make it clear when you're transitioning to a rebuttal, transitioning to a conclusion, showing an example, leading to your next argument. So use your words like, however, on the other hand, ultimately, what you use in essays. So use that clear signposting. And of course, introducing this that strategy of bookending that I've already mentioned. So just have more of a read if you didn't understand that explanation, because it's right there on the slide. So now we're going to look at statements of intention. As you can see, this is a introduction, quite lengthy, doesn't have to be as long. We'll talk about where you could cut it down, but essentially, how do you structure a statement of intention so that you can maximize your marks? And what are all the elements that you need to plan for to be discussed in your statement of intention. So your first paragraph or your sort of introduction should include all of the big picture ideas. Remember that this is an informal task, so you use first person for this, and it will probably be around 300 to 500 words, so not too long. So the deliberate choices or your own persuasive language techniques that you've implemented, you need to be quite selective in choosing what you wish to analyze. Don't just try to stick every random piece of evidence in, but choose the persuasive language techniques that you can analyze in the most interesting way, your intention behind including them. So first, that big picture ideas paragraph, that's a bit of an introduction, as we said. So firstly, you start off by introducing the issue that you are going to be talking about and saying, I've chosen to write an oral on this topic, um, and you can give some background information around the issue. And then you need to introduce your FLAPC factors in that paragraph as well, not in any particular order. So the form or the text type, of course, it's a persuasive speech for all of you, and some language choices. So if you have chosen to adopt a persona, you must state that, and you can also discuss a bit why you have chosen that persona. The register of your oral, is it formal or is it informal? Why? What kind of tone is throughout the piece? Um, Excluding tonal shifts, of course, that's a persuasive language technique you may use. What's your intended audience? Make this very specific. Don't want to be seeing the general public Australians. Make it as specific as possible. And that might even include listing several stakeholders. You might have several audience groups that are relevant to your oral. And then the purpose, which is really crucial. It's your message. It's essentially, why have I chosen to do this oral? What am I trying to convince of? What do I want readers to take away? Am I trying to raise awareness? Am I trying to propose a specific solution? Am I trying to demand this type of action, etc., etc.? Make that again very specific. So yeah, and then of course that contextual information. So you can use that mnemonic to help you remember. But essentially plan all those things out and consider them before you write. For example, if I didn't have a distinct tone in my oral, that would be a bit of a problem because there wouldn't be a clear voice to my piece, and it wouldn't be as engaging. So, and then of course you also struggle to write this statement of intention, which is 25% of your marks. And then those body paragraphs, analyzing your persuasive language techniques that you've chosen in like little mini body paragraphs. You don't need arguments here. You don't even need opening sentences. You can quite literally just do the what, how, why process of analysis. So quote a technique that you've used. Always need to quote, unless maybe it's like a structural element, but always quote and use the relevant meta language for the persuasive language technique and analyze it in terms of intended effect or how it contributes to argument, just how you have been doing for argument analysis. So here are some presentation strategies that you may choose to utilize for your oral presentation. Notice how we have some more subtle and nuanced techniques and also simple ones. So you want to have a bit of a variety. You're unavoidably going to have some techniques that are quite typical, doesn't stand out as much, like inclusive language, facts and statistics, etc. But then you're aiming to have some more subtle ones that will also be impactful, give you those higher marks, and will be interesting to analyze, such as tonal shifts, such as appeals, such as irony or sarcasm, etc. So have a look at that list if you're looking to get some more ideas. And now we'll look at the statement of intention. Remembering this is used that FLAPC structure that we had a look at. So we want to look through the elements and analyze which sort of part of that essential structure are we seeing included. Is anything being missed? It's not. So on the topic of Australia's obesity epidemic, I have decided to address the issue of whether or not overly sugary drinks should be taxed in Australia. So that's that context, introducing the issue, introducing the topic of the oral background information. Next, we introduce the form or the context. So clearly stating that it's a speech in terms of the text type and is being delivered to the Australian Senate. Now, there are some in this yellow, there is some language choices being explained as well as the persona that we have chosen to adopt. So, we've chosen to take on the persona of Richard Di Natale, the leader of the Australian Greens. I urgently and passionately contend, so this is our tone and our contention, our main argument, that taxing sugar is an essential change that needs to be made to combat obesity in Australia. I chose to adopt the persona of Richard Di Natale, as he's a passionate advocate for a tax on sugar in Australia. Being a former general practitioner, he's very knowledgeable in regards to issues involving public health and enthusiastically advocates for improvements in legislations regarding the health of Australians. So we see here that there's been quite a lot of explanation or justification to why this persona was chosen. Also, probably because it is a very specific persona. This is where, if you're looking at this thing and this is a bit long for that word count, this is where you could cut down, especially if you haven't chosen a specific persona. But we really need tone, contention, audience, text type, our own persona to be explained in our statement of intention. Introducing that context again as the speech is being presented in the Australian Senate, and more information about language, the tone for the piece, and the register. I've used the formal register because it's being presented in the Australian Senate. So notice how persona can influence a lot of our authorial choices. And the relevant conventions of a speech presented in the Senate, such as thanking the acting deputy president at the beginning. So again, reflected in the language choices, our persona. To project Di Natale's bold opinions supporting the taxation of sugar in Australia, I have used an urgent but measured tone. Then we have the purpose, essentially, what do we want to be done about the issue? The purpose of my speech is to convince my audience to support the taxation of sugar in Australia, with hopes to pass a bill that taxes overly sugary products by 20%. And the audience of my speech includes members of the Australian Senate. So there's some justification here for why that audience group was chosen also. I've specifically targeted the concerns of present and former senators such as Barnaby Joyce in my rebuttals for countering their arguments to help strengthen my contention, making it really clear that the reason this specific persona was adopted and the reason this specific audience was adopted was because they are the people holding the opposite opinion. So there's a lot of people in Parliament that were against this sugar tax, saying it wouldn't be good for the economy, etc. So this example, they've chosen to refute essentially that opinion of those politicians, and that's why they've chosen members of the Parliament as their audience.